Sudan's army says it's making gains in a counter-offensive against the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces after more than 3 years of conflict. The government has also begun a push to unite political groups. So how significant are these developments? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Nyberg. The Sudanese army is claiming recent gains against the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The government is signaling movement on the political front too, launching a national dialogue process to forge alliances with different groups. There's been widespread devastation with both sides accused of war crimes and attacks on civilians. About 25% of the population have been forced from their homes in what the UN has called the world's worst migration crisis. Around 20 million people don't have enough to eat, and drones have significantly changed the nature of this conflict. So, how important are these recent military and political developments? Could the conflict be entering a new phase? We'll try to find out from our guests shortly. First, though, this report from Imran Ullah Khan.
A conflict now spanning 3 years between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. Even as momentum has shifted, the consequences for civilians remain a constant. On Monday, Sudan's armed forces said they uncovered a mass grave. The remains of at least 25 people were buried there, including women and children. The grave was found in Karmuk, located in Sudan's Blue Nile state. The army regained control of the town last month after weeks of heavy fighting with the RSF. Currently, the army holds much of the north and east of Sudan, including Khartoum, while the RSF has consolidated its grip on large parts of the west of the country, including nearly all of the Darfur region. A current flashpoint of intense fighting between the army and the RSF is the city of El Ubaid in North Kordofan state. Just last month, the Sudanese army said it regained control of a major highway linking the capital Khartoum with El Ubaid, with analysts calling it a major blow to the RSF. With much attention focused on conflicts elsewhere in the world, Pope Leo spoke out on the weekend to urge more international pressure to stop the fighting.
I continue to follow with concern the tragic situation in Sudan, especially in the city of El Ubaid. In expressing my spiritual closeness to all the people of the nation, I renew my appeal to those in authority to guarantee humanitarian corridors for the civilian population. At the same time, I urge the international community to support efforts aimed at bringing about an immediate ceasefire.
On the humanitarian front, the UN says more than 14 million people have been displaced by the conflict, calling it the world's largest humanitarian crisis. That number includes 8 million people internally displaced due to the fighting, and 4.5 million refugees fleeing abroad. More than 21 million Sudanese don't have enough food to eat, including 6.3 million in the most dire state of food emergency. The country's civilian facilities are also feeling the brunt of the conflict, with 70% of hospitals destroyed. Sudan's army chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is expected to hold talks with members of civil society in the coming days, in the hopes of bringing about national dialogue, as much of the country remains an active battlefield. Imran Ullah Khan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let me go ahead and bring in our guests into this conversation. Joining us from Cardiff in the UK is Elbashir Idris, an independent Sudan analyst. From Geneva, we've got Mukesh Kapila, a former UN resident and humanitarian coordinator for Sudan. And joining us from Udine in Italy, Boswell, Horn of Africa director for the International Crisis Group. Thank you all three for joining us here on Inside Story today. I want to start with where we are right now. Elbashir, what's your sense of what's actually happening on the battlefield? Which side has the momentum now that we're more than 3 years into this conflict?
Well, I think after 3 years, we've definitely seen a major improvement on one particular side, and that is the Sudanese armed forces. Though both sides throughout this war have been condemned for human rights violations and war crimes, we have certainly seen from one side a lot more control and willingness to exercise caution and restraint than the other, that being the rapid support forces. All we need to do is just look at the previous examples of the rapid support forces, and even in your latest example of unearthing 25 bodies within Kurmuk. And as such, I believe that the momentum currently is on the way to SAF. However, as we've seen throughout this war, anything can happen and anything can change. But it's at this moment that as momentum is with SAF, not only on the battlefield, but it seems diplomatically and nationally, and even politically, the different stages are moving forward in favor of SAF and the regional allies to essentially put down this rebellion, not from a paramilitary, but certainly a terrorist militia force that has caused the world's biggest humanitarian crisis and migration crisis so far.
Alan, do you agree that the momentum is with SAF, or is this just the sort of normal ebb and flow of this conflict?
I think at the moment we're seeing more of the normal ebb and flow. There have been some recent army gains, both in the main front lines, in the Kordofans, and recently on this new front the RSF opened up earlier this year in Blue Nile. But we still see this conflict largely as a stalemate. I think the big headline story is that we are pretty much as far away from any sort of peace talks or a ceasefire than I think at any other point in this conflict thus far. And unfortunately, we see Sudan at the moment slipping into something like a more settled de facto partition along these lines until we see any further progress on that front. And the regional dynamics continue to be escalatory. And that's one of the reasons we don't see any momentum really on trying to end this war.
Mukesh, what's your reading of the humanitarian situation right now? You heard Elbashir mention some of that, but it's been called the world's worst humanitarian crisis with the worst humanitarian conditions on the planet. What are you seeing happening on the ground?
Well, I think that the situation has been getting progressively worse if you look at the statistics in terms of the number of hungry people, the volume of outbreaks of disease and other conditions, the malnutrition rates, the displacement, and the breakdown of infrastructure such as health clinics, hospitals, and the access of humanitarian workers to the different populations all over this vast country remains as unstable as ever. And the number of outflows, both internal and external, continue to grow. So whether or not the situation in the country is stabilizing or not is very much open to debate, as our colleagues have said. But on the humanitarian side, the situation remains extremely unstable and progressively getting worse.
Elbashir, this image that the war is sort of progressing on the army's side, is it as simple as that? Or is this an image that Al-Burhan actually wants to project to sort of serve his own political interests?
Well, certainly in the latter, let's not forget that the regional allies for the Sudanese armed forces, especially being Turkey and even Saudi Arabia, who have signed a Mecca agreement in terms of the defense pact with Pakistan also, that will have an effect within Sudan. As well, as we've seen recently with Pakistani armored vehicles moving into the country to bolster the Sudanese armed forces arsenal. However, that also comes on the high side of the UAE supporting the rapid support forces. So certainly in terms of this proxy elements of this war, in terms of the gears of war, it's still continuing on, though with the idea that the Sudanese armed forces is progressively doing better. I think we just need to look at the amount of defections that have happened, especially in this year and in the past few months, from the RSF to SAF. And the fact that the Sudanese armed forces is even willing to reabsorb these forces that have once terrorized the whole communities. Yes, when it comes down to a matter of principle, how can one force be able to forgive the enemy forces and yet still be causing harm and war on civilians? But maybe this is that chance now for the Sudanese government and for Al-Burhan to essentially not make this about him just trying to bolster legitimacy, which it seems like it is. But this should be taken as a real chance by him and his staff to try and create a national converging process when it comes to the political dialogue. Now, when it comes down to the actual realities of to be able to pull this off, well, so far we know that Burhan has already excluded the old Islamists that used to rule Sudan of 30 years, the National Congress Party, and the TASIS-led coalition, essentially the political and government arm of the Rapid Support Forces, who seek to control administration in the parts of RSF.
So is that
control.
a mistake to exclude them?
Come again?
Is that a mistake to exclude these two groups?
Well, it seems that both of them are reinforcing within their own areas and making a two-tier Sudan, essentially. The Sudan that thinks that can solve everything in terms of agreements and deals in back rooms, compared to the stories that you and I hear and our colleagues hear, which is drone strikes, the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and the more horrors of it. So what we have here is certainly two different sides who seem to be cementing their own power rather than trying to create a national unifying process. But maybe it is through this process that the army seeks to try and attract those from the other side, may that be military or even political, to essentially come back to the bosoms of the state. But that will be something we have to see first.
I'm just going to mention briefly that the UAE has categorically denied that it is actually supporting the RSF, just so that we have that on the record. Alan, I just want to ask you about this national dialogue here that Elbashir is talking about. There has been some accusations, mainly from the sources within the Sumud alliance. They're saying that this is not about a transfer to civilian rule. This is actually more about Al-Burhan to seek sort of political legitimacy for his military rule that actually seized power during the coup back in 2021. What do you think? Is this actually, this national dialogue, is it intended for Al-Burhan's own personal interest, or is it in the interest of Sudan?
Well, clearly, this is a national dialogue that Burhan has been trying to put together, and yes, to bolster his own political fortunes in a way. And it will largely include groups that are already on his side of the conflict. There are hopes to attract some of these more non-aligned groups, but the main block of that, the Sumud group, which you just referenced, has put out a statement condemning this entire process. I want to go back to what I mentioned earlier, which is, the narrative for the first few years of this war, but was about whether or not we could get to a ceasefire. We're now shifting towards a conversation about a political dialogue just within, pretty much the army camp. This is not a strategy towards peace. This is essentially a wartime political strategy, and we remain as far as ever from actually getting to an end to this war, unfortunately.
Mukesh, let's talk about the humanitarian situation again, because there has been warning from the UN that El Obeid is now at risk of becoming the next humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan, becoming the next Al-Fashir. How close are we to that becoming a reality?
Well, it's very worrisome because RSF are camped all around El Obeid, and if the Sudanese army was really on the ascendant, as we are led to believe by the recent advances, then I wish they would do something in terms of consolidating their position sufficiently as to allow both humanitarian access into El Obeid and to allow people an exit to safer places if that was the personal better option for them. In fact, connecting this humanitarian situation to the political discussion we've just had, I would say that if Burhan really wants credibility and really wants his dialogue to be both feasible and trusted, and if he really thinks that he is on the winning side, and if he's really got most of the country coming over to him, looking at the map that you projected earlier on, then I think a really true test of his sincerity in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of his own people is whether or not it improves a lot of the people that are within the geographical area that is currently under increasing army control. So as long as that doesn't happen, then I think most humanitarians will remain extremely skeptical, as will the public. So in short, on the humanitarian side, don't be fooled by either the military ebbs and flows on the ground or the political announcements, because quite honestly, these are fake hopes and false hopes, and these kinds of things are making the matter worse. The big other thing you should note is that whereas for the first couple of years or more, the resilience of the Sudanese community through their kitchens and whatnot and diaspora support and so on has kept the country going in a remarkable way. But I think in the last 6 months, what we are seeing is a breakdown of those community structures, and the last line of humanitarian defense has really been creaking, and in some cases completely overthrown. So, this sounds to me that I think the people doing the fighting, don't have the interests of the people in mind, and two, they are using the humanitarian situation to advance their own objectives, and three, they're going to fail. Because I think their credibility is going to suffer because they're failing on the humanitarian side.
Mukesh, it's been reported that Al-Burhan has repeatedly said that civilian democratic government remains the intended destination for this pathway of a national dialogue in Sudan. Do you think he would be actually willing to give up power and hand it over to a civilian government that then has to deal with all these problems with that humanitarian situation that you're talking about?
Well, in the end, if there ever is a solution to Sudan, and I don't think it's going to be in my lifetime, because unfortunately I'm getting quite old, but maybe it'll be in your lifetime as you're younger, it'll have to be a civilian democratic government. The question is a pathway to get there. We've got many examples from the world where the military and civilian have shared power on a route of transition into genuine democracies. So the question really is reduced to whether or not Burhan is sincere in wanting to eventually share the military power he has got, and then to fade out of the situation. But this is far too early. The situation on the ground is far too fragile, and there is no definitive victory on Burhan's side or the other side, unless there is a real de facto partition like we've had in the case of Sudan and South Sudan earlier on. So it's an unanswerable question at the moment. However, that does mean is that civilian forces, both inside and outside Sudan, should prepare, should get ready, should be debating the options that one day, perhaps, this might become a possibility. But I don't think this is imminent.
Alan, let me ask you to just go a bit further on that, because you mentioned that possibility or the risk of the country actually splitting up into two. I mean, how real is that risk, and what will be the consequences of that?
Sure. Well, I don't think there's a risk of that happening in a formal sense anytime soon. And the official position, even of RSF, is not for secession at the moment. So that isn't something that looks on the horizon in that sense. However, effectively, you have Sudan divided now between two different warring sides, the army and its government, and then the RSF, which has formed its own government, which no country recognizes. And if this is a more long-term durable military stalemate, which is what it looks like right now, then de facto Sudan is operating in this quasi-partition state. And meanwhile, the war is still going on and raging. So this isn't a quiet partition. This is Sudan being split, and the war is still continuing on at least three major fronts, and increasingly sucking in the wider region as well. Pretty much all of Sudan's neighbors are involved in the war one way or the other, and an increasing array of regional powers from the Middle East are also heavily involved now.
So just adding to this complex picture of what's going on in Sudan, Elbashir, we also have at least 150 different militias as reported to actually be part of this conflict. Plus, there's also reports now that the RSF, they've started a recruitment campaign among tribes, at least in the Darfur region. how does this change the dynamics of this conflict?
Well, in that last point, that's always been happening even before the war started, especially during this one. It still continues to do so, thus putting a lot more emphasis from the RSF side to be recruiting from ethnic and tribal lines, which is very opposite and ironic to the political objectives that they claim, which is that they want to create a whole unified Sudan away from the Islamists, away from regionalism, tribalism, and ethnicities. But at the same time, that does also happen on the SAF side and their regions and localities. But within the RSF, the idea that they have to recruit more from ethnic lines rather than anything ideological, I would love to hear from my fellow colleagues on what ideological battles the RSF seems to be fighting for, other than wiping out the Islamists, which I think is something that all parties other than Islamists agree on. That they don't really have a strong national vision or even a mandate. And it seems that mandate is coming in by the gun or both sides actually on that sense. However, when it comes to the future, and to comment further on my colleagues' sayings, it seems like it's two separate state building projects happening at the same time. One with the RSF, the other one with SAF. And to close that gap, to bridge that gap again, as it used to be before this war, will take a tremendous amount of effort from the civilian sides to be able to sit down after years of bad blood and decades of unresolved issues. Though after the world's worst humanitarian crisis, the ordeals that have not only to the Sudanese people, but those neighboring nations and Sudanese allies or humanitarians, after all this ordeal, being able to sit down on the table together and be able to review and understand just what happened is something that we all need. And that is something that should not be primarily only led by one particular side. As long as there's dialogue, it is much better than AK-47s firing all over the place. Even if it's from this side or that side, the fact that the people are speaking and not sitting in silence, this is a step forward, regardless of whether it'll take tomorrow, today, next year, or 10 years. There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to make sure that we touch on this very important point. The UN has raised the alarm about young children unable to go to school, especially in the Darfur region. According to the UN, 5 out of 6 children are out of school. Mukesh, what do you make of that? An entire generation not able to get education because of what's going on.
Absolutely. I think these 5 out of 6 children, hopefully many of them will grow up. They will grow up heavily traumatized. And we know from experiences within Sudan, South Sudan, in the region and wider elsewhere in Africa, that traumatized children make for traumatized adults. And traumatized adults make for conflicted adults who commit atrocities upon each other. And that in turn does not advance the cause of peace. So apart from the pure humanitarian situation of people dying from disease or hunger, which is terrible, there is a big element here that about the future of Sudan. So even whenever this dialogue takes place, and even if it's a credible dialogue, what exactly is the nature of this dialogue that is going to take place? And can traumatized people from any direction actually hold a meaningful dialogue? By the way, people are treating each other even as a fight to advantage themselves according to their own ideologies, which, as we've already said, we don't even know what people are fighting for because that's become very, very confused. And to me, the importance of humanitarian reserve line, something to do, keep going until people have the sense to come to their senses, is to really keep that their reservoir of humanity that one day might come out and paint a different picture for the country, whoever is surviving around that time, to actually make a new country or a couple of countries, if that's the way the history is going to shift. And for me, I would be sorry to see Sudan split up, but I'm much more interested in people surviving rather than countries surviving. So if the country needs to partition, as it did before, then let it partition, if that means a better humanity in the different parts of the country. there's no guarantee that will happen. So all in all, you can see there are a number of ways forward, but the central part of whichever way you go, if you want to reach a destination, it is about the degree of humanity that travels with you along that path.
Alan, you hear Mukesh calling for dialogue here. What do you think these groups like the Quad group or the Quintet group, can they contribute to this dialogue in any way to ensure a safe and prosperous future for the people of Sudan?
Sure. Well, let me paint a more hopeful picture, which is of where this could go, although I don't think it's the direction it will go. But you could imagine an internal dialogue process within essentially what is Burhan's camp and those on his side that's internal to Sudan. And then that links to this external process under the Quintet, this African Union-led process in Addis Ababa, which is trying to have a wider dialogue among civilians. And then that links to what is this Quad grouping you reference, which is the US and 3 Arab countries working to try to bring the warring parties towards a ceasefire. That's the overall architecture that if you ask diplomats, they say this is the direction this could head towards peace. But I'm struggling to come up with much real optimism at the moment towards it, because at the moment, the dynamics within that ceasefire track, especially the Quad one, are going completely in the wrong direction. The region is more at odds over Sudan than at any point since this war has started. And hence we see the war continuing for quite some time, which is really depressing for the Sudanese.
And with that, I want to say thank you to all three of our guests. That is Alan Boswell joining us from Udine in Italy, Mukesh Kapila joining us from Geneva, and also thank you to Elbashir Idris joining us from Cardiff. Thank you all. And thank you so much for watching. You can, of course, see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join this conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, though, that's it for me, Per Nyberg, and the whole team here in Doha. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in just a moment. Stay with us.